To arm Ukraine. In an Oval Office meeting with the NATO Secretary General, President Trump said the U.S. would make and send weapons to NATO allies who would then pay for them and in turn distribute the arms to Ukraine.
For months, Russian drones, missiles and satellites scanned every kilometer of Ukraine's supply routes, searching for any sign of NATO's arms shipments. Despite this relentless surveillance, weapons and ammunition continued to arrive in Ukraine, raising questions across the intelligence community. How did these deliveries slip through such a dense web of observation? Now, recent satellite imagery has revealed the answer. A covert rail line running from Poland directly into western Ukraine, hidden in plain sight for months. NATO transformed everyday tracks into a frontline supply chain, using secrecy and infrastructure upgrades to move military cargo undetected. Russia, with all its resources and rail expertise, never saw it coming. But how did such a major operation evade the notice of a nation renowned for its rail-based logistics and intelligence? The hidden rail line Russia missed. Russia's military logistics rely on a vast rail network, 105,000 kilometers, with over half of it electrified. This level of infrastructure has long given Russian commanders confidence in their ability to move and monitor military cargo. The railway troops, a specialized service dating back to the 19th century, have played a historic role in building and protecting these lines, especially during wartime. With this deep institutional expertise and technological investment, the idea that a NATO supply operation could unfold so close to Russian borders without detection seemed improbable. Yet satellite imagery and open-source analysis revealed just that. A previously overlooked rail corridor running from Poland into western Ukraine, suddenly showing signs of intense, coordinated activity. What had appeared to be a dormant or civilian line was, on closer inspection, something very different. OSINT analysts noticed a specific anomaly: the sudden appearance of covered transfer sheds at key junctions, visible in late-night satellite passes. These structures, not present in earlier imagery, hinted at efforts to conceal cargo transfers from aerial and orbital reconnaissance. NATO's approach hinged on transforming ordinary infrastructure into a near-invisible supply artery. Instead of constructing new lines, which would have drawn immediate attention, engineers reinforced existing rail beds to handle the weight of armoured vehicles. Covered loading stations were installed, allowing supplies to be transferred under shelter, out of view from satellites or drones. In select locations, camouflaged cargo areas were blended into the surrounding environment, making it difficult for even experienced analysts to distinguish military activity from routine freight operations. Operational tactics were equally precise. Train movements were scheduled for late-night hours, when satellite coverage was limited and the risk of visual detection was lowest. Deliveries were timed to avoid predictable patterns, and digital signal jammers were reportedly deployed along sections of the route, interfering with electronic surveillance and complicating any attempts at real-time tracking. In some sectors, air defense systems provided additional protection, creating a layered shield against strikes or reconnaissance flights. The effectiveness of this strategy was evident in its duration. For months, the rail line functioned undisturbed, providing a steady flow of military supplies into Ukraine. This success directly challenged Russian assumptions about their control over regional logistics. Russian intelligence has a track record of intercepting and disrupting enemy supply lines in past conflicts. But this time, their surveillance apparatus failed to detect a major operation unfolding within their sphere of influence. The oversight exposed a critical vulnerability. Reliance on traditional indicators and established patterns left Russian analysts unprepared for an adversary willing to innovate with civilian infrastructure. The OSINT community's eventual exposure of the rail line underscored the sophistication of modern open-source intelligence. By piecing together satellite images, train schedules, and infrastructure changes, analysts reconstructed the hidden supply chain. They identified refreshed tracks leading out of Poland, noted the installation of new covered sheds, and tracked irregular train activity through regions previously considered low priority. What appeared routine to most observers became, in aggregate, evidence of a coordinated and concealed logistics effort. The implications for the conflict are substantial. The covert rail line enabled NATO to deliver critical military assets that sustained Ukraine's defensive operations, bypassing the choke points and bottlenecks that Russian planners expected to control. The uninterrupted flow of supplies strengthened Ukraine's operational resilience and forced Russia to reconsider the reliability of its own intelligence gathering. This episode highlights a fundamental shift in the logistics of modern warfare. The ability to exploit civilian infrastructure, mask military intent, and operate undetected even under intense scrutiny. In a landscape dominated by satellites, drones, and constant digital surveillance, maintaining operational secrecy is a formidable challenge. Yet NATO's rail corridor managed to stay hidden long enough to make a decisive impact. This raises a new question. How did NATO sustain such secrecy? And what specific measures kept this supply line invisible for so long? NATO's strategy of secrecy relied on a disciplined blend of deception, operational control, and infrastructure adaptation. In an environment saturated with surveillance, the alliance's planners recognized that any overt military buildup would draw immediate attention. Instead, they embedded their supply chain within Poland and Ukraine's existing civilian rail networks, relying on the fact that no new tunnels, bridges, or visible construction would trigger the algorithms and analysts monitoring for military activity. This decision to use established tracks was fundamental. It eliminated the construction footprints and logistical signatures that Russia's intelligence services were trained to detect. The operational core of secrecy centered on restricting visibility at every stage. Trains carrying military equipment moved exclusively at night. This timing reduced exposure to both satellite reconnaissance and drone overflights, exploiting the gaps in Russian surveillance coverage. Electronic signal jammers accompanied high-priority convoys, disrupting drone feeds and intercepting efforts to geolocate shipments with electronic warfare tools. Along the most vulnerable stretches, mobile air defense systems provided a deterrent against low-altitude reconnaissance and potential strikes, ensuring that even if the movement was detected, any attempt to target it would face a credible threat. To further obscure the nature of their cargo, NATO and its partners upgraded the rail infrastructure in subtle but significant ways. Rail beds were reinforced to handle the weight of armored vehicles and heavy artillery. But these upgrades were carried out under the guise of routine maintenance. Adjacent to the tracks, cargo handling areas were camouflaged, some using natural terrain, others shielded by purpose-built coverings. At key transfer points, covered loading stations concealed the transfer of military equipment, making it impossible for overhead imagery to distinguish between humanitarian aid and military hardware. In some cases, OSINT analysts later identified false loading structures that appeared in satellite images but were disconnected from the main rail line, deliberate misdirection designed to confuse outside observers. Operational discipline extended to communications. Any radio traffic or logistical chatter near the rail line focused on civilian priorities, such as humanitarian shipments or essential goods. This reinforced the appearance of routine activity, masking the scale and purpose of the operation. The blending of military and civilian logistics was not just a matter of physical concealment, but of narrative control, ensuring that even if some information leaked, it would be dismissed as part of standard wartime supply efforts. The effectiveness of these measures showed in the timeline. For months, Russia's intelligence apparatus, despite its experience and resources, failed to recognize the true purpose of the rail corridor. The absence of new infrastructure, The irregular timing of shipments and the use of camouflaged facilities denied Russian analysts the usual patterns they relied on to detect military operations. Even open-source intelligence communities, which aggregate vast amounts of publicly available data, required weeks of cross-referencing satellite images, infrastructure changes, and train schedules before the full scope of the operation became clear. NATO's approach exposed the limitations of traditional intelligence in the face of modern, hybrid logistics. The reliance on pattern recognition and technological monitoring was undermined by an adversary willing to operate below the threshold of conventional detection. By embedding military logistics within civilian movement and using electronic warfare to disrupt surveillance, NATO effectively neutralized Russia's primary tools for interdicting supply lines. This was not simply a matter of avoiding detection. The secrecy measures ensured that critical deliveries, tanks, artillery, guided munitions, arrived in Ukraine without delay or interference. The rail corridor's efficiency allowed for bulk shipments that would have been impossible by road or air, supporting Ukraine's ability to sustain high-intensity operations and respond to shifting battlefield conditions. The uninterrupted flow of these assets during decisive phases of the conflict challenged Russia's assumptions about its ability to strangle Ukrainian resupply efforts. The exposure of the covert rail line stands as a case study in the evolving nature of military logistics. Modern warfare demands not only firepower, but also the ability to move and protect that firepower under the constant threat of surveillance and attack. NATO's use of existing civilian infrastructure, combined with a disciplined counter-surveillance playbook, demonstrates how operational security can shape the outcome of a conflict. As the details of this operation come into focus, the next question is clear. What exactly was moving along this hidden rail line, and how did it impact the fighting on the ground? In the next section, we'll uncover the exact mix of armored vehicles and rocket systems that turned the tide for Ukraine's defense. The arsenal on the rails. Shipments along the covert rail line represented more than routine resupply. They were the core of Ukraine's operational resilience. Open-source intelligence tracked multiple flatbed convoys carrying M113 armored vehicles, Leopard tanks, and HIMARS systems over several weeks, confirming the sustained and systematic nature of these deliveries. Each movement required precise coordination. These were heavy, high-value assets, and the logistical challenges of transporting them safely and efficiently were considerable. Rail was not just the preferred method, it was the only viable option for moving such bulk and weight under the constant threat of Russian interdiction. Air transport, while effective for select high-priority assets, proved inadequate for large-scale deliveries. The sheer mass of Leopard tanks, each weighing over 60 tons, and the size of HIMARS rocket systems made airlifts impractical. More critically, Russia's air defense network forced many air corridors to reroute or delay flights, sharply increasing the risks and reducing throughput. Rail transport, by contrast, allowed NATO to move heavy armor and artillery in bulk, shielded from the vulnerabilities of airspace exposure and capable of sustaining the high operational tempo Ukraine needed. NATO's planning extended well before the first shipments rolled out. Intelligence suggests that logistical groundwork was laid months in advance. Segments of existing track were reinforced, transfer hubs were upgraded, and key equipment was pre-positioned along the route. Covered loading zones enabled rapid, concealed cargo transfers, while the fortified railbeds ensured the line could bear the weight of NATO's heaviest vehicles. OSINT analysts noted that these upgrades coincided with a pattern of nighttime convoys, further limiting the risk of detection. Among the most significant shipments were HIMARS systems, which have become central to Ukraine's precision strike capability. Their range and accuracy have allowed Ukrainian forces to target Russian supply depots, bridges, and command centers deep behind the front lines. The ability to deliver HIMARS in bulk by rail meant these systems could be rapidly deployed to areas where they would have the greatest tactical impact. OSINT reporting linked the arrival of new HIMARS units via the covert line to a series of strikes that disrupted Russian logistics and forced operational shifts, particularly during the summer counteroffensive. Leopard 2 tanks, supplied by Germany, were another critical component of these shipments. Their arrival on the battlefield gave Ukraine a decisive edge in firepower and armoured manoeuvre, especially during the push in the Zaporizhia and Kharkiv regions. The logistical reality is clear. Moving several Leopard tanks at once by rail allowed Ukrainian units to reinforce key sectors without the delays and vulnerabilities of road convoys. This efficiency was pivotal in enabling rapid, coordinated, armoured assaults that caught Russian forces off guard. M113 armoured vehicles, while less imposing than tanks or rocket systems, played a vital role in troop transport and casualty evacuation under fire. Their presence on the front lines, enabled by bulk rail delivery, ensured that Ukrainian forces maintained mobility even in contested areas. OSINT analysts observed multiple convoys of M113s, underscoring the breadth of the logistical effort and the emphasis on sustaining operational momentum. The covert rail line also moved vast quantities of ammunition, fuel, and repair equipment. Drawing on Russian military logistics for comparison, flatbed rail platforms in similar deployments routinely carry over a ton of ammunition per cart. NATO's use of these platforms ensured that Ukrainian units received the munitions and supplies necessary for continuous operations, even under sustained Russian bombardment. This scale of delivery is rarely possible by road and virtually impossible by air. The impact of this logistical operation became most visible during Ukraine's counter-offensive phases in 2023, particularly in the Kharkiv region. The sudden deployment of Leopard tanks and HIMARS systems, delivered by the covert rail line, enabled Ukrainian forces to break through prepared Russian defenses, reclaim territory, and disrupt enemy supply lines. The timing and scale of these deliveries shifted battlefield dynamics, forcing Russian units into reactive postures and exposing weaknesses in their own logistics. NATO's ability to sustain this flow of heavy weaponry and supplies, shielded from Russian detection for months, underscores the strategic value of the covert rail operation. It demonstrates how the intersection of logistics, intelligence, and operational security can shape outcomes in modern warfare. The exposure of this supply line would soon provoke a reaction from Russia's intelligence apparatus, raising questions about how such a critical operation could have remained hidden in the first place. Russia's missed opportunity. Russia's intelligence apparatus has long prided itself on its capacity for persistent surveillance and rapid response. Yet the covert NATO rail line exposed a significant vulnerability. For months, Western weapons and equipment moved along this route without detection, undermining Russia's confidence in its ability to monitor and interdict critical supply chains. The Kremlin's initial reaction to news of the rail line was marked by silence. State media refrained from comment until independent analysts published satellite imagery and logistics data on major telegram channels, forcing the issue into the public domain. Only then did official outlets begin to address the operation, signaling a clear information lag and suggesting that the Russian leadership had been caught off guard by the revelation. When the Kremlin did respond, its messaging focused on claims that the rail connection represented a violation of Ukraine's neutrality commitments and an escalation of NATO involvement in the conflict. Officials described the supply route as a deliberate provocation, arguing that it blurred established boundaries and threatened to widen the war. This narrative, however, emerged only after months of uninterrupted deliveries had already shifted the operational balance on the ground. The delayed public statements revealed both surprise and frustration as Russian authorities sought to reframe the intelligence lapse as evidence of Western aggression rather than an internal failure. Following the exposure of the rail line, Russia shifted its strategy to direct action, launching intensified drone and missile strikes against Ukrainian rail infrastructure. open source reporting documented a surge in attacks on rail yards and depots in Lviv and Rivne oblasts, key logistical nodes in western Ukraine. These strikes targeted critical supply points in an attempt to disrupt further arms transfers and regain the initiative. Yet, the timing of these attacks, coming only after the rail line's existence became public knowledge, underscored a reactive posture. The main operational advantage had already been secured by NATO, and Russia's efforts to blunt the supply chain arrived after the decisive window had closed. NATO's ability to maintain secrecy relied on a suite of counter-surveillance measures that neutralized Russian reconnaissance assets. Nighttime train movements, widespread use of signal jamming, and camouflaged infrastructure rendered traditional intelligence tools, such as satellite imagery and radar, ineffective. For a country that has historically relied on layered surveillance and rapid interdiction, this blind spot represented a significant operational setback. The alliance's use of existing civilian infrastructure further complicated detection, as the absence of new construction or overt military signatures allowed the supply route to blend into the background of routine logistics. The magnitude of this intelligence failure becomes even more apparent when contrasted with Russia's own rail-based logistics innovations. In Krasnoarmysk and other contested areas, Russian forces have deployed remotely operated railway platforms to transport ammunition and supplies to the front, minimizing risk to personnel and maintaining the flow of material under fire. These unmanned rail carts exemplify Russia's emphasis on rail as a backbone of military logistics. Yet, despite this focus and technological adaptation, Russian intelligence failed to identify or disrupt NATO's covert operation in western Ukraine. The contrast between Russia's proactive use of rail technology elsewhere and its oversight in this instance highlights a critical inconsistency in surveillance and threat assessment. NATO's preparation extended beyond simple concealment. The alliance invested months in upgrading civilian tracks, constructing covered loading stations, and pre-positioning equipment, each step designed to evade detection. By leveraging the dual-use nature of rail infrastructure, NATO blurred the distinction between humanitarian and military activity, further complicating Russian efforts to classify and target the route. This deliberate ambiguity exploited gaps in Russian intelligence methodology, which often relies on clear visual or electronic indicators of military intent. The Kremlin's subsequent condemnation of the rail line as a NATO escalation reflects more than operational frustration. It signals recognition of a strategic setback, an admission that Western planners succeeded in bypassing Russian scrutiny and altering the dynamics of the conflict. The intensified strikes on Ukrainian rail depots served not only as an attempt to disrupt ongoing logistics, but also as a response to the symbolic blow delivered by the covert operation. Yet these measures could not reverse the months of unimpeded deliveries that had already shaped the battlefield. This episode raises broader questions about the effectiveness and adaptability of Russia's intelligence apparatus. The rail line's concealment exposed the limitations of surveillance dependent on established patterns and technological monitoring. It also demonstrated that adversaries willing to innovate with civilian infrastructure can outmaneuver even well-resourced intelligence networks. As NATO's logistical ingenuity forced a reassessment within Russian circles, the conflict's focus shifted from open confrontation to the subtleties of deception and countermeasures. With the covert rail line now public knowledge, the consequences for both sides extend beyond immediate tactical outcomes. The operation stands as a clear indicator of shifting dynamics in military logistics and intelligence warfare, setting the stage for new forms of competition in the shadows. The covert rail line stands as a clear demonstration of NATO's ability to adapt and innovate under pressure, while exposing a major gap in Russia's intelligence operations. By turning civilian railways into a secure military corridor, NATO enabled a steady flow of advanced weaponry and supplies directly influencing the survival and effectiveness of Ukrainian units on the front lines. As the conflict continues, the question shifts to what other covert logistics tactics may be in play or yet to emerge. Which covert logistics tactic do you think NATO will unveil next? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The reality remains. These hidden supply lines have become lifelines for those fighting at the sharpest edge of the war.